So good afternoon and welcome. My name is Alicia Torres. I'm the Senior Director of Communications and Hispanic Outreach at Child Trends. And on behalf of the Child Trends Hispanic Institute and our partners on this project, the Crimsonbridge Foundation, we'd like to welcome you to this webinar on our recently released guide entitled Reaching and Engaging the Hispanic Communities, a research-informed communication guide for nonprofits, policymakers, and funders. As you may know, Child Trends is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization in the DC area. For more than 38 years, Child Trends has produced research and analyses related to all aspects of children's well-being, and we've made sure that that information gets into the hands of people who can use it to make decisions about the lives of children. 2 years ago, we launched our Child Trends Hispanic Institute to better address the issues that are affecting the growing number of Latino children in our country. Over a year ago, we partnered with the Crimsonbridge Foundation. We identified the need for this guide and examined the question, what do we know about how best to communicate with Latino families? We conducted research and heard from people on the ground, both providers and parents, to inform this guide. So today, we will be sharing with you the key highlights from the guide. We will share what we learned about how the Latino communities prefer to be addressed and communicated with. We will review our research-based recommendations for effectively communicating and engaging the communities. And then you will hear perspectives from diverse stakeholders regarding the need for this guide and the use of strategic communications in serving Latino communities. Before introducing our panelists, I'd like to review a few technical issues. Throughout the webinar, if you have any technical questions, please submit them online. You will see a chat box on the right-hand side of your screen where you can easily submit questions to our team. They will get back to you. This is the same place where you can submit questions to our panelists at any time during the presentation. We will queue them up and present them once all presentations have been completed. We estimate that we will have about 10 minutes for Q&A. During this webinar, we encourage you to join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #ReachingLatinos. You can also follow at Child Trends and at Crimsonbridge DC for more resources on engaging with Latino children and families. So I'm going to introduce our 5 panelists today. I'm going in the order in which you'll be hearing from them. First, you'll hear from Danielle Reyes, the Executive Director of the Crimsonbridge Foundation, who will provide introductory remarks. She will later also serve as a discussant following the presentation of the guide. Danielle has worked with philanthropy and the nonprofit sector for more than 20 years as a leader, a strategist, and advisor in the areas of innovative and inclusive philanthropy, nonprofit capacity building, leadership and organizational development, and social media. She holds a master's degree in administration, planning, and social policy from Harvard University's Graduate School of Education. Then you will hear from me. As I mentioned earlier, I'm the Senior Director of Communications and Hispanic Outreach at Child Trends and one of the authors of this guide. So in addition to serving as your moderator for the webinar, I will also introduce the guide. My background is in strategic communications and policy. I hold a doctorate in communications from the University of Texas and have devoted more than 20 years of my career to putting that knowledge to use, making sure that the right people have the information and the evidence that they need to make decisions to improve lives. Then you will hear from my colleague, Selma Caal, a research scientist at Child Trends, who is also an author of this guide, who will present the recommendations. Her research focuses on Latino families and children, particularly in social and emotional development of children and youth, and in helping to effectively engage the community. Selma has extensive experience working with Latino families, children, and youth in applied settings as a preschool teacher and as a family counselor, including in Head Start. She has a doctorate in applied developmental psychology from George Mason University. Then we will have our 3 discussants. Our first discussant will be Sandra Gutierrez, Sandra is the founder and national director of Abriendo Puertas, Opening Doors, the nation's first evidence-based comprehensive training program for Latino parents with children ages 0 to 5. She serves as an advisory board member for Too Small to Fail initiative. In March of 2014, Sandra was named by the White House as a Cesar E. Chavez Champion of Change. And in February 2015, she was recognized by the James Irvine Foundation with their Leadership Award. Then you will hear from Ann Rivera. Ann is a social science research analyst at Health and Human Services Office of Planning, Research and Evaluation, where she oversees research grants and contracts focused primarily on early care and education, specifically Head Start and child care programs, and on improving human services for Hispanic, immigrant, cultural, and linguistic minority populations. She serves as a program officer for the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families, among a number of other key programs. Ann holds a PhD in community psychology from New York University. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Danielle for her introductory remarks.
Thank you, Alicia. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I am so pleased to be joining you, and on behalf of the Crimsonbridge Foundation, our president and founder, Gabriella Smith, I wanted to thank Child Trends for its partnership, collaboration, and really the depth of work that went into creating this publication and conducting this research. The Crimsonbridge Foundation is an entrepreneurial philanthropic organization that believes wholeheartedly and from experience in the transformative power of education. Our mission is to build bridges of collaboration and strategically invest in education, leadership development, and capacity building programs to help America's youth and nonprofit organizations achieve their potential. We value and feel very fortunate to work directly with nonprofit service providers, faith-based organizations, schools, and other philanthropic partners who are providing innovative programs and offering critical direct services to Hispanic communities throughout the country, and who are increasingly aware of the need for strategic outreach and relevant communications tools to be more effective in their work with Spanish-speaking families. So in response to this need, the Crimsonbridge Foundation was very eager to be involved in and to support this work. And we hope that this guide will not only facilitate the building of effective communication strategies for nonprofits and policymakers, but will also encourage our peers, funders, to invest in nonprofit communications as a way to support their program investments. We're so pleased to have more than 750 people registered for this webinar, and we look forward to hearing your reactions, feedback, and hopefully future stories related to effective communication strategies for hashtag Reaching Latinos, and would love to hear from you via social media. Thanks, Elisa. I'll send it back to you.
Thank you, Danielle. So now I will present the overview of the guide. Sorry, I moved this too quickly. Okay. The communication guide has been prepared for service providers and educators who work with Latino or Hispanic children and their families, in particular those working with low-income families, for the funders who partner with them, as Danielle just mentioned, and for policymakers whose work impacts the programs that serve Latinos. So why did we decide to focus on communication? Well, effective communication strategies are integral to an organization's success. It helps organizations advance their mission, their goals, and their capacity to serve. Effective communication strategies are also key to developing strong and lasting relationships in the communities and to streamline operations and to maximize the impact of resources that an organization may have. So for example, a well-crafted message can attract new people to an agency. It can clearly communicate what the services are and the eligibility requirement, and facilitates then the participant's self-selection. And you will hear later on about how the research has found that in fact many Latinos do not access services at the same rate as their peers, even when they're eligible, due to a misunderstanding and an assumption that they do not qualify. So it is especially important, the communications component is especially important in reaching Latino families. And finally, funders want to be confident, as we just heard from Danielle, and increasingly they want to make sure that their contributions are used effectively, and increasingly we're seeing that funders are interested in looking at core communication support in organizations in order to do just that. So why did we decide to focus on Latino communities? As many of you know, a fourth of all children, all the kids of the United States are currently Latino. It is the fastest growing and the largest racial ethnic group of children in the country, and within about a few more decades will represent a third of all children, a similar proportion as white children in this country. So how today's children develop and grow will have important implications for the future of the country. But unfortunately, many Latino children are growing up facing many challenges. We know that 2/3 live at or near poverty, which means that the majority of all Latino children in the country today form part of the population that is being served by policies and programs aimed at improving outcomes for children, their healthy development, and future well-being. So Latinos are becoming an increasingly larger share of the country. And as they do, there are a number of stakeholders who are paying closer attention to them for many reasons. So for example, today more than 90% of all Latino children are born in the United States. As U.S. citizenship has grown, so have the number of those eligible to vote. And as you can see here, there was a threefold increase in less than 30 years between 1986 and 2014 of those eligible to vote, from 7.5 million to 25.2 million in 2014. And as you see here in this map, it translates into an important share of electorate in a number of states. Those in the darker colors on this map indicate states where Latinos represent an important sector of the total electorate. This is something that during the election season is front and center. So those are a few reasons we focused on Latinos, but why did we decide to focus on service providers? As the Latino population has indeed grown, so have organizations that provide services. To make a difference, they must be able to reach and engage effectively with families, and service providers like schools exist for the communities they serve. It doesn't matter whether they're financed with public or private money, whether they're fee for service or membership fees. And we know, though, that not all providers have experience with working with Latino communities. Some already have a strong track record, but others are learning to respond to the needs of their new or expanding base, as there are a number of new communities developing in non-traditional places throughout the country, like in rural areas of the Deep South. And there is a lot of service providers there that are just not set up to work with the growing Latino communities in their area. Even those with deep roots and long-established communities can benefit from reassessing how they're reaching their target audience and determining their changing needs. And we heard a lot from those in LA and San Antonio and different parts of the country that their own communities are changing so rapidly that they really do feel that they need to practice and stay in touch and, strategic communications, basically. So in taking all of these things into consideration, particularly the need to better ensure that families are aware of the services, we decided to develop this guide. The guide is informed by research. We conducted an extensive review of the literature. We looked at questions such as, what do we know about where Latinos get their information? What are their trusted sources? How do they prefer to be referred to? And how does this change among the diverse communities across the country? Because as you know, there are many different countries of origin within the Latino communities. We then took this information to the field, and we heard from parents in 5 different focus groups from many different countries of origin, included parents from the country of origin of Mexico, Central American countries, South American countries, Caribbean countries. We also conducted 14 interviews with providers across the country who worked in organizations providing social, educational, or health services. And so we heard from a range of demographics and geographic areas. We took all of that research findings and we used this strategic communication framework to develop our guide. And it all begins with knowing your audience. Knowing your audience is the basis for you to develop achievable objectives that meet their needs. Knowing your audience provides a roadmap for developing messages that speak to the communities you serve in a way that makes sense and resonates among them in their preferred language. And to implement outreach strategies based on their preferences and trusted sources of information. Then when you're executing your communication outreach with the kinds of products that you may be developing, it is really important to develop metrics that will help you gauge the effectiveness of your efforts and indicate ways you can improve your next effort. This is an overview of the approach, and now I will turn it over to my colleague, Selma Cal, who will present you with the overview of our key recommendations.
Well, thank you very much, Alicia, and thank you everybody for attending our webinar. This is a really good afternoon for us to get together and talk a little bit more about the recommendations that we have here. So drawing from the communications framework that Alicia just told you about, first we recommend to know your audience. Differences between communities are likely to influence how Latinos receive and interpret the messages that you give them, and also how they respond to your outreach efforts. To get to know your audience, we recommend conducting an audience assessment. You'll want to understand the diversity of this community, their heritage and culture. As you may know, some Latinos have been here for generations. Others have immigrated from different countries of Latin America and have settled in different geographic areas in the United States. It is also important to pay close attention to language preferences. Some Latinos may be bilingual, while others may be English dominant, and others may be Spanish dominant. Also, like English-speaking countries, Latinos from different countries may use different words that actually have the same meaning. For example, in Mexico, the word chamaco is used, is a word for child. Well, this word is not necessarily used in other parts of Latin America. Also, understand the needs of your Latino audience relating to the services that your organization provides, and identify how they gather and access information, and also what are the trusted sources that they use to access this information. Now, this pie gives us a sense of the diversity among Latinos living here in the United States. As you see, the background of Latinos comes from different Latin American countries, with the majority coming from Mexico. Based on our research, we also recommend that you take note of the preferences Latinos have so you can build your outreach efforts around these preferences. What we know that messages that take into consideration the audience's preferences are more effective. For example, let Latinos self-identify. This may engage them more in your outreach efforts. While the U.S. Census Bureau and most news outlets have opted to use Latino and Hispanic interchangeably, as you see here in this slide, in this graph, most Latinos identify themselves by their family's country of origin. This is the top graph that we have, the top bar that we have in this graph. And also, let's give an example of this. If you see the second bar of this graph, 66% of Dominicans self-identify as Dominican, whereas 17% identify as Hispanic or Latino, and 16% identify as American. However, it was interesting that this was not necessarily the case in our focus groups. Some parents define themselves as Hispanic, while others define themselves as Latinos, and a few prefer to self-identify with their own country of origin. All of these parents have their own reasons for their self-identification. And we also recommend that you take note of the community's preferences for outreach efforts. As many of you may know, through our research we found that personal contact remains the most direct and effective way for service providers and educators to communicate with Latino families. Personal contact such as door-to-door visits, distributing flyers to people out on the street, but also engaging in conversations with them, meeting parents and students where they are, going to schools and school bus stops and community events are also good examples of personal contact. While most of you would agree that these can be labor intensive, our research and literature review suggests that these outreach efforts are effective to reach Latinos, especially hard to reach audiences. To strengthen buy-in from Latino families, we recommend that you build partnerships and leverage influencers. Partnering with well-respected, trusted community organizations such as schools, those serving children, is a good idea. We heard from parents that they are receptive to the information when it comes from organizations they trust. Now, working with influencers can be another effective strategy to reach your Latino audience. An influencer is a person that the families may turn to for advice and counsel, typically because this person has more knowledge or information about the issue in question. So this gives this person the credibility to effectively give advice to the family and also call for action. Some good examples of an influencer would be a teacher, a pediatrician. Now, you may also want to use texting and phone calls as a way to complement and reinforce other communication efforts. We heard from focus group participants that they prefer face-to-face interactions, as I said to you before, but they also said that phone calls could also help them engage directly with the provider. This was particularly the case for participants with low to no literacy skills. These participants said that they may not be able to read a flyer or go onto a website, but they are able to engage in conversations with the provider, especially if a bilingual person contacts them. Now, we also suggest reaching Latinos through the media sources they rely on most. We know from extensive research and over the years that most people still use traditional media. And in fact, local TV news is the primary source for information across the country and across ethnic and racial groups. For example, 90% of African Americans rely on local TV news, as do 80% of whites, and as do 79% of Hispanics. In addition, we also know that Latinos rely on Latino-specific news for information in their community. And on the radio, Spanish language radio stations still dominate. As you see in this quote, we also heard this from our focus group participants. This parent notes that she watches local TV news to hear the morning news, to learn about school cancellations and traffic. Now, we would also say take advantage of social media platforms, especially when reaching out to younger Latinos. Like others in the country, Latinos are increasingly using social media networks such as Facebook, specifically to get in touch with family and friends. Organizations may want to consider how a social media can fit into their outreach and communication strategy, again, especially if the organizations are serving young adults. It can be a really good, cost-effective way to communicate program information, and it could also help develop rapport and build community with the right population. Now, having said all of this, while providers we interviewed did not find social media very effective in engaging with the Latino community, with some subsets of the Latino communities, they found that social media was most useful in peer-to-peer communication communication with other funders, and also if they served youth, that this would be effective with a young Latino audiences. Now, in line with what providers said about social media use to reach youth, we see here in this graph basically the social media use of Hispanic adults. In the top bar, we see that young Latinos make up the greatest share of Hispanics who gets their news and information from social media outlets. The top bar tells us 7 out of every 10 Latinos ages 18 to 29 say they get news or news headlines from social media networking sites. By contrast, only 1 out of every 10 Latino adults ages 65 and older do the same. This graph suggests that compared to their counterparts, low-income Latinos, Latinos with less than a high school education, foreign-born, and Spanish-dominant Latinos are less likely to access social media. So I would say that the takeaway of this slide is that a social media campaign can be most useful for a subset of the Latino population, young Latinos or young adults, native-born, and English-dominant. Now this graph gives us a wealth of information, especially for those organizations who want to reach specific subsets of Latinos, because it provides us information of what technology Latinos have available to them. If you see here, this slide gives us the ownership of computer, which is in the yellow bar, cell phone, ownership of cell phone, blue bar, and smartphone ownership in red bar. And also it gives us the information by demographics. For example, let's take a look at Spanish-dominant Latinos. A small percentage of them have a smartphone compared to the other groups. And also, let's take a look at those with higher income. A high percent of Latinos with an income of $50,000 or more have a smartphone. So taking together the information from this slide and the previous one, we recommend that you do your homework before launching a social media campaign aimed at Latinos, keeping in mind the age, income, place of birth, and language preference of your Latino audience. We also learned from focus group participants and the literature review that many low-income Latino families rely on their smartphone for internet access, either because they don't have access to a computer or they lack the technical skills to do so. As such, organizations may want to optimize their website for mobile devices. Also consider using video on your websites as a way to inform users about your services and how they can reach to you, how can they reach you directly. Parents using the internet in our focus groups stated that videos of the parents providing testimonials about the services would be an effective way to get information to them. These videos would not only provide testimonials, but they would also provide information about the services and how the population can reach these services. It is important to keep in mind that not all households have access to the internet. Not all Latino households have access to the internet. Lower income families still lack a home computer or a smartphone, as I discussed a little while ago with that other slide. And even in homes with computers or smartphones, there are still barriers to going online. Families may have reached their data plans, their data plan limits. They may experience interruption in services. They may have internet service plans that are not affordable. Families may have slow or aging devices, or they may simply have to share these devices with multiple family members. Now, to optimize your outreach, it is important to track your results to learn from your outreach strategies. Keeping track of your communication efforts will allow you to adjust your strategy. Once you have your tracking information, think critically about which components of your strategy were most effective and which ones were least effective, and why is that? This obviously will help you gain a perspective about the communication process that you have, and also it will help you refine and improve your communication strategies going forward to reach your desired Latino audience. Now with that, I will turn it over to Alicia for some summarizing remarks and for her to open it to other panelists.
Thank you, Selma. So before hearing from our discussants, we wanted to summarize our overview of the guide. Basically, an effective communication strategy will be a comprehensive one that takes into account different ways of reaching your audience based on what you learn about your audience. This approach will help you determine how best to reach the populations most in need of the services you're providing, and will guide you to effectively reach and engage the families. An effective communications strategy will provide knowledge on how to establish consistent, productive, and ongoing dialogues between the providers and the communities that you serve, and on how to maximize your impact with available financial resources. And ultimately, an effective communication strategy contributes to helping to improve the lives and prospects for success for the largest and fastest growing racial and ethnic group of children in the country. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Sandra Gutierrez, who will be our first discussant. Sandra?
Thank you very much, and gracias to everyone who's listening and for their interest in this subject. As you can see on our the next slide, please, the byline of our program is Building a Better Future Through Parent Leadership, and that's possible only when you have an effective communication strategy where those aspirations that parents and the families have become a reality with the information and the services that they need. I want to thank the Child Trends Hispanic Institute for the many resources, excellent resources they've provided since they began, that have served us, all of us, in the that work hard to help support and honor parents and families throughout the country. Thank them for their many resources, and specifically to the Crimsonbridge Foundation for producing this guide, which is truly a gift in that it helps us build a better future by providing effective communication strategies. I'll speak very briefly about Abriendo Puertas, opening doors, and talk a little bit about how we use the recommendations that are in the guide. So this is a gift, but it's also a very practical gift that I think all of us on the line can find many ways to use. What is Abriendo Puertas, opening doors? Next slide, please. It program, one of the unique features of it, thank you very much, is it's one of the largest culturally relevant programs, parent training programs in the U.S. I think the unique feature, what's important to remember about the program, is that it was co-created with parents, by and for parents, with kids 0 to 5. It's developed in English and in Spanish, and it's used widely throughout the country in 324 cities and in Puerto Rico. We give credit not only to the growing demographic, but to the fact that the program was developed with a lot of listening, as the guide recommends, so that we were very well aware of the concerns, the beliefs, the questions, and the information that parents needed. As the guide, the parents of our program is also grounded in best practices and in research. We use popular education methodology, which honors what people already know through their life experiences, and it's been proven through many studies to build the capacity of parents as leaders of their family and as advocates. As we all know, parenting is very personal, and thus it is very cultural and intimate, and it's important to listen to what parents want before we proceed with what's needed. Next slide, please. Here we'll have just a small photo of a slide that shows how we demonstrate physically the difference between a brain that is nurtured and one that is not. What's important that I wanted to talk about in terms of the guide is the many lessons that the guide has that we've learned. much of our growth has been because we did listen first to the community, as I already said, and that is how we developed our program. We work with a great variety of parents throughout the country, many low-income and immigrant families, and this guide is one of the first that honors that it takes to work with specific communities in mind and works with the specific characteristics of each community in mind. And I can't stress the importance of knowing, of you recognizing that one size does not fit all, and this guide definitely encourages knowing your audience intimately before providing information. And in our case, we found that face-to-face and direct communication was the key, given that the parenting information was very personal. We wanted to also create social capital among the parents, so we chose to go with face-to-face and direct communication. Not to assume, as I said earlier, that all Latinos are comfortable with the website is a lesson we learned early on. We heard feedback from parents throughout the country that it would make a huge difference if there was a welcoming figure, someone that they, another parent, a trusted messenger, that would welcome them onto the site and navigate how to use it before they began to use it. It was, as I said earlier, the languages, knowing people's language preferences is key. Not everyone speaks Spanish, not everyone speaks English. It's important to know your community, as well as technological use. As mentioned earlier, many do not feel comfortable or do not have access yet to the technology, and it's important for our programs to know exactly what is happening in the local community in order to successfully honor and support our communities and do what our programs are intended to do. If we could move to the next slide, I just want to revisit the next slide, which is the communication guide that is in the framework that's in the guide. This is really key for us, and I find that not only does it serve as a communication framework, it's an excellent guide to improve services. You start with listening, and you end with data collection, so you can also see what you need to change in order to have better results. So we're really using this guide. It's posted on our wall, and it can be used beyond communication, but also for service providing. As with all folks, Latinos are, like everyone else, are not one size fits all. When we wanted to inform, next slide, please. I'm going to speak just very briefly about how we've used the guide. We've used it in multiple ways, the messages in the guide. In particular, into next slide, please. Informing our large community that we work with, our network throughout the country, about EITC, we thought it would be best to send a message through our listserv. Next slide, please, if I can, but I'll continue. And yet we found that the framework, the parents decided, the partners decided that it would be better to inform parents about EITC and through sessions in Spanish and through sessions in English. Different sessions. Some also followed up with phone calls. Some called experts to come in and give calls. So our one-size-fits-all of informing parents through a listserv was found not to be effective, and the specific, more local strategies were the ones that our partners used and found to be effective. So I'll end with that. There's a very famous dicho in Spanish that says, del dicho al hecho hay mucho trecho. From what you say to what you do, there can be a great deal of space. So I think this guide really helps us check ourselves, make sure that we're meeting our goals. It's very helpful. It's a gift to help us reach our goals, and I want to appreciate the Crimsonbridge and Foundation and the Child Trends for giving us this, for investing in this really important and growing population, and for helping us honor and serve them better. So I thank you for your attention, and thank you for letting me be part of this important webinar.
Thank you, Sandra, and our apologies. We didn't have that last slide in the deck. So I thank you very much, Sandra, and what I'd like to do is now turn it over to Ann Rivera, who will be our second discussion.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me to reflect on the wonderful resource that you've presented, that you've developed and presented today. As you know, as many of you may know, the Administration for Children and Families is a division of the Department of Health and Human Services that administers several federal programs that are designed to promote the economic and social well-being of children, individuals, and communities. ACF's programs include temporary assistance for needy families, Head Start, child care subsidies, and many other programs that aim to strengthen families and individuals and to address the needs of vulnerable populations in the U.S. ACF's mission is to serve low-income and vulnerable populations, and it has several initiatives underway to better address the human service needs of underserved and underrepresented populations, including Hispanics. These include a variety of efforts focused not only on Hispanics, but on new Americans, on equity and inclusion, language access, as well as the administration for Native Americans. And so our objectives in many of these initiatives are both inward and outward facing, asking questions about what we can do within the agency to better understand needs and experiences of the underrepresented populations, and what we can do to better engage, respond to, and serve vulnerable populations. The initiatives originate in a recognition that some programs may not be reaching or serving some populations as well. We funded a few years ago the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families that is also housed in partnership between Child Trends and Apt Associates, and this center and ACF's intention in funding the center grew out of the need to inform our efforts about how to best engage and serve Hispanic children and families. And we were not finding the research and the evidence about low-income Hispanic families that we needed at the federal level or for ACF grantees that are providing services on the ground. I'd like to highlight some findings from the center that are informing ACF and that really reinforce the need for careful assessment and thoughtful approaches to engaging with Hispanic families in our communities, which is in the research developed by the Hispanic Institute. If you could go to the next slide, please. So the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families recently estimated that 2/3 of Hispanic children live in poor or nearly poor households. And of course, other recent analyses have estimated that the number of Hispanic children under 4 years of age are actually significantly underestimated in census data. So clearly there is a great deal of need among Hispanic children if we look at economic circumstances in their homes. And at the same time, we find that rates of participation among Hispanic families vary significantly across ACF's programs. The reasons aren't clear, and decades of research have suggested various barriers that may prevent families from receiving assistance or services, even among families who could really use the help from public programs and who seem to be eligible. While barriers may be locally situated often, for example, there is variation in state or local implementation of assistance programs. Some practices or procedures may be discouraging or overly burdensome, but there is clearly a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation in our communities. As evidence of this, I'd like to draw your attention to this other recent study completed by the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families. Last year, the center analyzed nationally representative data to examine participation in public assistance programs among low-income Hispanic parents. Some noteworthy findings that I have found very compelling and that I think are relevant to the resource presented today, I'd like to draw your attention to the two categories on the far right of the diagram. So when low-income families, parents, were asked their reasons for not applying for public assistance, across these last two categories, you'll see that 1 in 4, so across these two categories, 1 in 4 low-income Hispanic parents report that they did not apply for public assistance if they were eligible. Now, prior research within smaller samples looking at specific means-tested programs, such as child care subsidies or welfare have found that many Hispanic families aren't aware of benefits that are available for them or for their children, or believe that they are not eligible for public assistance. But these estimates here that are based on nationally representative data demonstrate just how prevalent this may be. You may be asking about how many respondents may actually be accurate in thinking that they aren't eligible for some programs, for example, among Hispanic immigrants. So looking more closely at this group, if you'll go to the next slide, please. Among foreign-born Hispanic parents, 9% of naturalized citizens and 36% of legal permanent residents believe they are not eligible to receive assistance, when they may in fact be eligible for many programs. Now, while there are barriers and preferences that may keep some Hispanic families from receiving public assistance and services, it is a mistake to assume that communities in a target population or area are not utilizing services because they don't need them, or they have a cultural preference not to participate in some services or programs. You know, these questions are knowable, and we can find out about the prevalence of need, we can find out what people might need, want, or use, and we can apply this information to improve our communication and the approaches we're using to serve Hispanic families, as well as other underrepresented communities. So ACF is supporting research like the 2 studies I've described to better understand the needs of the population at national level or in large areas. And I think that we can build on the Hispanic Institute's recommendations with the growing research about low-income and vulnerable Hispanic children and families to continue developing strategies to better engage and serve Hispanic children and families. For organizations listening today that are interested in learning about the population in their area, the ways it may be changing, and the diversity of experiences and needs among Hispanics in their area, I want to highlight a few public resources and tools that have also been developed by the Center that may be helpful as you try to apply some of the recommendations made today. So if you'll go to the next slide. The studies that I've mentioned, as I said, present data at a national level generally to better understand the needs and experiences of Hispanic children and families. But there are some tools that have been designed to support agencies' development of more inclusive and culturally responsive approaches to serving communities in their local areas. So the first, making national data local, using American Fact Finder to describe local Hispanic communities, provides guidance for programs about using publicly available data to better understand the populations in their area and how local communities may have changed. And to illustrate, the guide actually provides specific examples of key demographic characteristics that are for understanding within the Hispanic population in an area. The second, online data tools for exploring local demographics, a focus on Hispanics, summarizes key characteristics of 10 publicly available online tools that the public can use to get estimates of local Hispanic populations. And it also includes information about how well each tool allows you to examine the diversity within the Hispanic population in their area. And finally, there's a program resource guide under development supporting the development of culturally responsive approaches to serving diverse populations, which will offer specific guidance and links to publicly available resources and tools to support organizations' capacity to respond to the changing demographics within their communities. I'm so grateful for the work of the Hispanic Institute in creating this resource and in developing these recommendations. And I appreciate that it reminds us not to make assumptions about Hispanic families or any family. And it encourages us to seek out information about Hispanic communities and to use it to plan carefully for how to reach and serve them better. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, very much. Okay, and now I'd like to turn it over to Danielle, who will address the issue of the guide from a funder's perspective. Danielle.
Thank you, Alicia. So what I really want to focus on, you can go to the next slide, is return on investment. I think despite having data, research, recommendations for developing effective communication strategies, many nonprofit organizations that I've worked with still struggle to build the case and obtain the necessary funding to develop a communications plan specifically to engage the Hispanic community. It's a real challenge, despite the fact that we know audiences are changing, demands on nonprofits are growing, and there's a need to be more relevant and effective than ever. So you might ask, well, how can that be? But consider the pushback. We often hear that word of mouth is very effective in reaching the Latino community. So if word of mouth is effective and nonprofits are already at capacity with demand exceeding services, why invest limited resources in more specific communications such as bilingual staff time, human translation, video, microsites, radio airtime? All of these things cost money. So how do we make that case? I think for some of you I'm preaching to the choir, but for others, getting that green light from your organization's leadership and getting the funding for communications can be a challenge. So how do we build a case? Next slide, please. The way to build a case, and I'm speaking largely with the foundation community, but first you have to build it internally if you haven't already, is to note that the power of communications is real. Corporations know it, politicians and certainly campaign managers know it, and many nonprofits know it but haven't been able to benefit from the same returns. A well-rounded case points out both sides of this challenge, and so it's important to consider doing two things. One is something as a foundation we hear a good deal about, which is capturing the cost of not investing in communications. No nonprofit likes to talk about inefficiencies of how they do their work, and especially not to funders. But when asked, many nonprofits will share that lack of appropriate communications information about their services and programs leads them to spend countless staff hours fielding inquiries and conducting intake with individuals they simply cannot serve. The loss of staff time brings down morale. It's a loss of resources and precious funding dollars better spent on direct services and programs. Not to mention the loss of time for a mother who just bought 3 metro tickets and dragged her kids across town, as well as the damage it does, that failed visit does, to building trust in the community. Sadly, many organizations will tell you that they absorb this as a cost of doing business because raising communication dollars on top of program dollars is challenging or seems impossible. As funders, we have to show more awareness and understanding here and recognize that investing in communications should go hand in hand with investing in program and nonprofit operations. The other side of this coin is, of course, to speak to the return on investment and the positive return. If you look at this slide, quickly I'll just point out that good communications builds relationships and connection to community, adds value to your work and your brand, respects and better serves the individuals you are trying to reach, leads to better service delivery, outcomes, and greater mission success. And finally, strong communications can help position an organization as a trusted source, which the research from this guide tells us is something highly valued in the Latino community. Next slide. So to get the most on return on investment, we want to emphasize those communication investments that the data and research tell us are most effective. And we heard from both the respondents how important it is to consider not consider a one-size-fits-all approach and focus on actually knowing your audience. So this slide, what we've done is compiled just some examples of investments as well as returns. They're not in an order, but to speak to them briefly, person-to-person contact, as we heard in the research, though this can be costly, in-person contact or phones answered by a Spanish speaker are still the method of choice. So if we know this, how do we respond to this? How can we look to ways to do this in a cost-effective, strategic, impactful way? Building partnerships, working with bilingual staff can be cost-effective and also help build trust, build with the community. I think what we've heard from some folks as far as bilingual staff, is that it limits the hiring pool. But for most of us who are in hiring, we need to consider that this can be, limiting a pool in this day and age can be a good and helpful thing. Another area is human translation. There are tools that do auto-translate, but it's not only inaccurate, but it most likely will not capture the nuance of your organization, your approach, your heart, your soul, the philosophical ways in which you do your work. And so it's important to figure out where you can use auto-translate and where you really should invest in human translation. Mobile apps, video, radio, these are important for us to look at as we move forward in building any communication strategy. Latinos are the highest mobile app user population in the country, so we're talking about making information that's on the web accessible via cell phones over laptops. We also know NPR reported that Latinos are more likely than other Americans to watch online videos. And yet there hasn't been much of an effort to help nonprofit organizations develop special content for them. Though fortunately this is becoming more affordable. The last two notes I have on here about relevant outreach and intake, many researching your audience, to be relevant means researching your audience and developing appropriate materials. Are you trying to reach newcomers, second generation, youth, seniors? Relevance is key to effective communications and for people believing that you are the right organization to go to. Another key player in this piece is women, and the importance of knowing that women are the center of Latino households, and whether it's aunties or madrinas or abuelas, they are often the power brokers, information sharers, and decision makers in the community. So engaging women as community ambassadors or using models that already exist, the Madrinas model that University of Notre Dame has developed, or promotoras models that health organizations use, can be a great way to both acknowledge the role of women as well as benefiting from that role. An investment that we didn't mention here that we've heard also feedback on is about cultural competency training for organizations. Which is something that more foundations, as they look to investing in equity work, have recognized can be an important tool and resource for helping organizations communicate more effectively. The returns, clearly positive engagement, expanding the network, creating ambassadors, the accuracy, which is a time saver and a cost saver, means more effective reach, more time to deliver services, and we really want to support the staff, the key nonprofit individuals who are doing this work day in and day out. Next slide.
Okay, there it goes. Danielle.
Yeah, so the next slide is case studies, and I'll just say briefly, since we're short on time, that we've invested in a few different organizations already. We'd be happy to follow up with other foundations who would like to hear more about those investments, but they include things from human translation, funding video, funding microsites instead of whole translation sites, and in some cases funding website development for much more comprehensive websites that include tools such as scheduling, calendars, appointment building, and other types of resources that help nonprofits do their work. Last slide. So I'll move it back to Alicia just to say that the question is not whether to invest in we can afford to invest in communications, but whether we can afford not to. It's an area that's important, that's growing, and it just makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. And we are really running out of time, and there are a number of questions that came in. I just want to address a couple of them very quickly. A lot of people were asking about, will the PowerPoint slides be available, and where can they get more information about, the different components to this framework. And the guide is available online. If you just Google the name of the guide, and Child Trends, you will be able to download the entire guide, and it has a lot of information there. We will also have this webinar up on the Child Trends website within a couple of days if you want to rewatch it or listen to it more carefully. With that, I'd like to just say a lot of the questions that came in had to do with the different stages of this, and one person asking a lot about the issue of translations. And we like to say that it is really important not to translate something, but to reproduce it in a cultural way for the audience that you are, reproduce it in Spanish in a culturally effective, sensitive way for the communities you're serving. But there's more information about that in the guide. We have been asked also whether or not the guide can be made available to federal policymakers, different federally funded service programs such as Head Start. And I guess, Anne, if you could answer that very quickly.
The question is whether the guide can be made available?
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
it's publicly available, right?
Yes.
So I think
Yes.
it's available to everyone, right?
Right, right.
Right.
You're saying can it be, made available and used, yes. So, so I'm sorry to say that we have run out of time, and I do want to thank everyone for participating. If you would like to ask some questions, we will try to get to your questions via, you could send us an email, and or you can reach out to us through social media, and we can address some more of your questions. But I'd like to thank everyone for participating, and take the special thanks to the Crimsonbridge Foundation for helping us to identify the need for this guide. So once again, thank you all, and have a good day. Thanks. Bye-bye.